Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into Chernobyl's global fallout and the Welsh connection. Let's set the scene. It's the early hours of April 26, 1986. Inside Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a late-night safety test goes sideways. Design flaws meet human error, steam meets fuel, and in an instant a runaway reaction tears the reactor open. There's no standard containment dome to hold it. The building ruptures, fire erupts, and a column of radioactive material is hurled straight into the atmosphere. Not just smoke, a cocktail of isotopes, iodine, cesium, strontium, plutonium. Think of it as a glitter bomb you never want to touch, thrown a mile high. Now here's where this stops being a local story. The atmosphere is a highway system, and weather is the traffic. Once those particles hit the upper air, they don't respect borders or ideologies. Winds pull them into vast currents, and meteorology becomes destiny. Over hours and days, the plume rides changing air streams, curling first over Belarus and Scandinavia, then pivoting across Western Europe. When those particles meet clouds and rain, they come back down to Earth. It's called wet deposition. In plain English, where it rained, it landed. This is how a disaster in Soviet Ukraine started showing up on instruments hundreds, even thousands, of kilometers away. Radiation monitors in Sweden trip first. Labs in Germany, in France, across the continent start seeing spikes. And across the sea, the United Kingdom watches the maps and the skies. Here's the surprising twist: the terrain and weather of upland Britain, especially Wales, are perfectly designed to catch what the winds are carrying. Prevailing westerlies and shifting fronts collide with mountains and hills. Moist air rises, cools, squeezes out rain. Those showers are the delivery system that brings down tiny particles like cesium-137 onto open pastures. Within days, measurable contamination shows up in parts of the UK, not because Chernobyl is nearby, but because the atmosphere ties us all together. And we have to remember the political soundtrack of the 1980s. Nuclear energy is not just a technology, it's a symbol. The Cold War is still humming. Governments are balancing three competing pressures: public safety, public confidence, and geopolitical posture. In that environment, how you communicate becomes almost as important as what the instruments say. Do you emphasize caution and risk the panic that could spill into policy? Or do you emphasize calm and risk missing localized hotspots that matter to farmers and families? Those are not abstract questions. They determine how quickly warnings are issued, where monitoring teams are sent, and which communities get attention first. So here's the thesis for this episode. Chernobyl was not simply an Eastern European catastrophe. It was a continental event with local consequences shaped by weather, geography, and Paul. Picture this. It's only days after the reactor at Chernobyl tore itself apart, and in the uplands of Wales, life seems unchanged. Rolling green pastures, low stone walls, sheep grazing under a misty sky. But invisible in that gentle rain is a stowaway, cesium-137, a radioactive isotope with a half-life of about 30 years. It doesn't just disappear with the next sunny day. It binds to the soil, the grass, and anything that eats that grass. The science behind this is straightforward, and that's part of what makes it unnerving. Heavy rainfall is nature's scrub brush for the atmosphere, washing particles out of the air and onto the ground. But in this case, it wasn't dust or pollen being washed down. It was fallout from a nuclear explosion thousands of kilometers away. In upland Wales, the weather patterns worked like a funnel. The high terrain forces moist air upward, cooling it, making clouds heavier with rain. That rain was the delivery system, and the sheep pastures were the target. Now, sheep farming in Wales isn't just a quaint postcard scene. It's the backbone of rural life. Families have run flocks on those hills for generations. It's a living, a tradition, and in many ways a cultural identity. But once sheep graze on contaminated grass, the problem follows them. Radioactive cesium can be detected in the animal's meat, and when you're trying to sell that meat, detection means restrictions. In 1986, that meant sudden, long-term movement bans on flocks from contaminated areas. Farmers couldn't simply move animals to cleaner pastures or to market. The economic ripple was immediate. No sales meant no income, and no income in a rural economy is like pulling bricks from the foundation of a house. The government's monitoring teams moved in quickly enough to measure radiation levels, but their findings didn't just end up in lab reports. They became legal limits. Control orders were issued, essentially, a lockdown for livestock. And these weren't short-term measures. Some areas would remain under restriction for years. Imagine being a farmer whose livelihood depends on seasonal sales, suddenly told that not only can you not sell this season's animals, you might not be able to sell next year's either. Bills keep coming, but the gates stay shut. And here's the subtle irony: Wales was not part of the nuclear disaster's cause, but it became part of its footprint. Geography and weather made it so. The rain in these hills carried more than water, it carried the legacy of a reactor fire thousands of kilometers away. And for the farmer standing in those fields, that legacy wasn't measured in geopolitical debates. It was measured in lost income, idle flocks, and uncertainty about the safety of the land itself. In the next part, we'll explore what happened when the science and the politics collided, and why the truth about contamination didn't always match what the public was told. Now we come to one of the most uncomfortable parts of the story, the gap between what was known and what was said. In the weeks after Chernobyl's fallout reached Wales, monitoring stations and field teams were gathering data. Instruments were showing clear numbers on contamination levels. But when those numbers were translated into official public reports, something happened. The figures didn't always match. The tone shifted. The urgency softened. This is what we call an information gap, and it can be just as dangerous as the contamination itself. Why the downplay? Part of it was about protecting the nuclear industry's reputation. In the 1980s, nuclear power wasn't just another source of electricity, it was a cornerstone of national energy policy and a point of pride in technological progress. Admitting that fallout from a foreign reactor could contaminate British farmland risked stoking public fear not just about Chernobyl, but about the safety of Britain's own reactors. That fear could translate into political pressure, and political pressure could lead to costly policy changes. For those in positions of authority, that was a risk they didn't want to take. And then there was the Cold War backdrop. The UK was part of a geopolitical balancing act, where relationships with allies and adversaries alike were shaped by perceptions of strength and stability. If Britain publicly amplified the dangers, it might escalate tensions with the Soviet Union or cause ripple effects in European nuclear cooperation. On the other hand, staying quiet, or minimizing the problem, could keep those diplomatic waters calm, at least for the moment. The result? Authorities walked a careful line in public statements, often emphasizing that contamination levels were within safe limits while quietly acknowledging in internal documents that certain hotspots exceeded those thresholds. In practice, this meant that some communities, especially in rural Wales, didn't have the full picture of the risks they were facing. Decisions about grazing, food consumption, and even outdoor activities were made without access to the same data the government had on its desks. This raises a fundamental question: when a government chooses to manage perception over disclosing the full scope of a hazard, whose safety are they really prioritizing? Is it the public's health, or the stability of political and industrial systems? History gives us many examples where short-term image management came at the expense of long-term trust, and this is one of them. Next, we'll see what those long-term effects looked like on the ground, in both the bodies of the people and the balance sheets of the farmers who lived through it. By now, the initial headlines about Chernobyl had faded from the front pages. The reactor was entombed in concrete, international attention had shifted elsewhere, and the world was moving on. But in rural Wales, the story wasn't over, it was just settling in for the long haul. Let's start with health. Radiation exposure is tricky. It doesn't leave visible scars, and it doesn't always make people sick immediately. But over the years, studies in affected Welsh regions began to show troubling patterns. Elevated rates of certain cancers, more cases of related illnesses in areas that had recorded higher contamination levels. These weren't statistical blips, they were consistent trends across decades. For families in those communities, it wasn't an abstract debate about risk levels, it was neighbors, friends, and relatives facing diagnoses that made them wonder if the rain from April 1986 had left something behind in more than just the soil. And then there's the economy. Sheep farming in Wales isn't a sideline, it's the economic backbone for many rural areas. The contamination, the movement restrictions, and the lingering stigma around the safety of meat from the region hit revenues hard. Some farms saw their income collapse almost overnight. And this wasn't just one bad year. It became a multi-generational strain. Parents who had expected to pass down thriving family farms instead found themselves handing over land still tied to a disaster from the other side of Europe. In some cases, younger generations left farming entirely, breaking a chain of rural life that had endured for centuries. Now, the government did introduce compensation programs. On paper, these were meant to help affected farmers weather the storm, literally and figuratively. But the reality was more complicated. Relief was partial at best, often slowed down by bureaucratic hurdles and tangled in narrow eligibility rules. Some farmers qualified, others didn't, and many felt the payments were too small to cover the real losses. The process itself could be exhausting, requiring endless paperwork and inspections at a time when what they really needed was stability. So what you had was a perfect storm of long-term harm, lingering health concerns, a wounded economy, and partial relief that left many feeling abandoned. And because the disaster's cause was so far away, there was no single local villain to hold accountable. The damage was diffuse, the responsibility blurred, and the suffering became something quietly carried by communities who had no say in the events that caused it. In the next section, we'll look at how the way decisions were made, and who got to make them, shape these outcomes, and why certain policy choices ended up making the harm worse rather than better. When you look at how the aftermath of Chernobyl played out in Wales, one pattern jumps off the page: the decision-making was centralized, top-down, and far more concerned with national image than with the realities of rural safety. Let's break that down. In theory, centralized control can respond quickly to a crisis. A few key people can make big decisions without waiting for layers of debate. But in practice, the central authorities were operating under a powerful set of incentives that had little to do with the actual needs of the farmers and communities on the ground. Their priorities? Preserve public confidence in nuclear power, avoid stirring up political embarrassment, prevent the kind of panic that could ripple into demands for costly reforms. What does that mean in real terms? It meant that instead of empowering local monitoring, which could have identified the worst contamination hotspots more precisely, they relied on selective testing and broad, sometimes overly optimistic public statements. When local officials or scientists tried to sound the alarm more strongly, their warnings often got filtered or delayed before reaching the public. The idea was that controlled messaging would keep everything calm. But calm at what cost? When information is softened for the sake of avoiding alarm, people can't make informed decisions about their own safety. And then there's the way compensation and support programs were structured. From the center, these looked like relief measures. But on the ground, the design of these programs created perverse incentives. If admitting higher contamination levels might expand the pool of eligible farmers, and therefore increase the cost, the pressure was to keep those official readings conservative. If extending restrictions would mean more years of payouts, there was an incentive to lift them as soon as they could be plausibly justified, even if that meant pushing the risk back onto the farmers themselves. This isn't just a Welsh story. It's a case study in what happens when a government's first priority in a disaster is managing optics rather than maximizing safety. Centralized decision-making without strong local input can miss vital details. It can turn relief into rationed appeasement, and it can leave the people most affected feeling like they're playing a role in someone else's carefully staged performance. In the next slide, we'll see how this fits into a much larger, global pattern, one that shows up again and again in other nuclear disasters, far beyond Wales and far beyond 1986. By now, it might be tempting to see the Welsh fallout story as a strange, isolated consequence of geography, a one-off twist in the tale of Chernobyl. But step back, and you start to see something bigger. This isn't just about one disaster. It's about a pattern, a playbook, that repeats itself whenever large-scale nuclear accidents happen. Take a step back to 1957, the Windscale fire in northwest England. A reactor used for producing weapons-grade plutonium catches fire, releasing radioactive iodine into the air. The government is quick to downplay the scale, insisting the danger is minimal, even while secretly ordering milk from a 200-square-mile area to be destroyed. Public image first, detailed transparency second. Fast forward to 2011, Fukushima, Japan. An earthquake and tsunami cripple a nuclear plant, causing meltdowns and releasing radioactive material. Again, in the early days, official communication focuses on control, reassurance, and protecting the broader nuclear industry's reputation, both domestically and internationally. Later, independent studies reveal contamination levels and health risks that were higher, or spread farther, than initially admitted. And sitting in between those events, you have Chernobyl in 1986, with Wales as one of the unexpected recipients of its fallout. In each case, whether it's the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, or Japan, the sequence is strikingly familiar. First, the event, then the closed-loop decision-making among officials, then the careful public messaging designed to prevent panic, which often means withholding the full picture. Finally, the slow release of more complete data, usually after the immediate political storm has passed. The Welsh experience after Chernobyl is proof that you don't have to be anywhere near a nuclear plant to be caught up in this cycle. Distance doesn't guarantee safety, not when the atmosphere is involved, and certainly not when the information you're given is filtered through layers of political and economic calculation. And perhaps the most telling part? Each time, when the dust settles, sometimes literally, the systems that made those choices often stay in place. The lesson learned isn't always never again, but rather, next time, manage the message better. That brings us to the final slide, where we'll step back from the details and ask the harder questions about trust, about transparency, and about whether communities can ever truly be prepared when the information they depend on might be shaped by someone else's agenda. When we pull all these threads together, the picture is as unsettling as it is clear. The Chernobyl disaster was born in the Soviet Union, but its consequences touched places and people far beyond its borders, places like the quiet hills of Wales, where farmers and families found themselves caught in the invisible wake of a reactor fire thousands of kilometers away. So what do we take from this? First, the obvious but often ignored truth: radiation doesn't care about your flag, your language, or your distance from the source. The same winds that carry warm summer air can carry fallout. Geography can make you vulnerable even when politics makes you feel distant. And when contamination arrives quietly, in the form of invisible particles, the only real defense is timely, accurate information. And yet, time and again, we've seen how that information is filtered, delayed, or softened before it reaches the people who need it most. Not always because of malice, sometimes because of fear, or because the systems in place reward keeping things under control rather than letting the public see the full, messy truth. But the result is the same: trust erodes, harm deepens, and communities are left to navigate the aftermath without the tools they deserve. That's the moral question hanging over every one of these events. When disaster strikes, who gets to decide what we're told, and when? And more importantly, who pays the price when those decisions turn out to be wrong? If Wales teaches us anything, it's that the victims aren't always the ones you expect, and the real damage can last far longer than the news cycle. There's another lesson here too. Resilience doesn't just come from central plans and government responses. It comes from communities knowing how to monitor, share, and act on their own information. It comes from the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions before the next crisis, not after. Chernobyl's shadow still stretches over Wales, not as a daily fear, but as a reminder that in a world connected by air, water, and trade, there are no true local disasters. And unless the systems we rely on learn to value truth over image, history's playbook will keep repeating itself. If you found this look into Chernobyl's hidden impact thought-provoking, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you want to dive deeper into the parts of history that are too often ignored, check out my book, History They Tried to Erase. You'll find the link in the description. For more thoughtful and entertaining history, explore the other videos on this channel. You never know what part of the past might still be shaping your present.